So next week at the Quest Wednesdays, the theme is personal boundaries. And I'm curious, Darren, like what do boundaries mean to you?
Well, you know the definition of boundaries, which is, what's okay and what's not okay for me. When I think about that, I just realized that for me to have boundaries, I've got to, first of all, have the sense that I have a right to say what's okay and what's not okay. And I was brought up in a family where boundaries were never taught or role modeled. So, a couple of the phrases that we were brought up with was, you'll get what you're given, so you can't have any other expectation. You just receive what you're given,
Mm,
and speak when you're spoken to. So don't have a voice and don't ask for anything. So I didn't
mm,
really have a concept of boundaries. And I think it's really been problematic for me because then what it led to was resentment and hurt when people weren't honoring my silent needs,
mm,
and that then ultimately led to severance. So instead of having a boundary, I ended up having a barrier. Like I would just walk away from people, cut people off because they weren't listening to my needs, which I wasn't even asking for. So it created this kind of negative spiral. And it's only been really in the last, since we've been doing the work, really, that I've really took on board the idea of boundaries. And I find it challenging to say I'd like this or I'd like that, because I was taught to believe that I didn't have any right to ask for things. I
mm.
just had to wait to be given. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. Yeah. And I'm nodding away as you're speaking because I can relate to every aspect of what you've just shared, actually. And in fact, the example that was coming to mind as you were talking was I remember an appraisal I got from one of my line managers when I must have been in my early 20s. And I'll never forget the line. He had written, Ade expects others to know his needs without ever asking.
Mm.
I remember it, and I remember being so pissed off that he would write such a thing. And I would tell that story to anyone who would dare listen. Like, how dare he? How dare he say that? Who does he think he is? Um, and there was something about it that I knew at a deep level that it was true. But I never really owned it until many, many years later, after having been with, say, partners or friends who would reflect that back to me. Because there used to be this part of me that would be like, you ought to know that this is a boundary. You ought to know that we set the appointment for 2 o'clock and you're meant to be at 2 o'clock and you're turning up at 2:30. You ought to know this. And yeah, I really struggled and sometimes still do struggle with not just expressing the boundaries, but identifying what that boundary is. So I think very often for me, probably less so now, but still very often, what happens is I know it's a boundary when it's been crossed.
Mm.
When there's been that violation, that's when I'll go, oh, yeah, I really feel invalidated as a result of that. But the problem is, I wasn't really clear that it was a boundary for me. So I think ultimately for me, there is something around worthiness that comes up.
Mm.
There is this sense of, there's a part of me that feels I'm not good enough, I'm not worthy, and therefore, I don't need to be setting these boundaries explicitly. They're there, but I'm not going to be explicit about it. You're going to guess what that boundary is. I'm not going to tell you, but based on my body language and my mind, you ought to know what that boundary is.
My God, we're like two peas in a pod because everything you're saying, it resonates so much. And I just think I love these Quest Wednesdays because a simple theme like personal boundaries, once you dig underneath it, there's so much richness, um, putting the pieces together and working it out. So I'm hoping that the guys that decide to join us, also start to dig into some of that rich, fertile territory.
Yeah, me too. It's going to be a very rich conversation.